everybody, and thank you so much for joining us today. To give our lovely hosts a little introduction, my name is Hannah, and I'm a third-year student at U of C in natural science. And with me today is Justice and Lily. Justice, if you want to give yourself a quick introduction.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Hi, Matt. My name's Justice. I am a graduate from the University of Alberta, and I've been with YCR for about 2 years now. And yeah, I'm really interested to see what Matt has to present for us today on, is it World Recycling Day today? Or is that tomorrow? Or no, tomorrow's St. Patrick's Day. What am I talking about?
Hi, Matt. So my name's Lily. So I've been with YCR for about a year now. I graduated from the journalism program at SAIT in 2019. So I'm really excited to hear your presentation.
SAIT? Good. Saskatchewan representative.
Perfect.
No, SAIT is Southern Alberta Institute of Technology.
Yeah. And then we've
Unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to cheat you out of a little Saskatchewan representation there. Welcome back to YCR's Food for Thought series. For those of you who are just seeing YCR for the first time, we are an advocacy group made by students and young professionals for students and young professionals. We believe that Canada can have a strong future in resources, the economy, and the environment. Please connect with us on our social media. We have Instagram, Facebook, and LinkedIn. All of them are at YC Resources if you want to learn more about what we do. Today, we are super lucky to have Matt Wolsfeld joining us today. Matt is the Community Engagement Coordinator with the University of Saskatchewan Office of Sustainability. He works with students, staff, and faculty across campus to ensure that the community is educated on sustainability and that they understand how it applies to them and on campus, and that they have the agency to take action into their own hands in a variety of ways. Before I hand the floor over to Matt, please know that attendees are encouraged to ask questions throughout the presentation using the Q&A box below for anyone on the Zoom. And for anyone that is watching on the Facebook, please feel free to drop questions in the comment section at any time. Thank you so much for joining us today, Matt. I will get out of your way here and let you share your presentation, but super excited to have you.
Okay, and you're just getting my slide? Yeah, looks like it. Okay, perfect. Well, thank you very much for having me. My name is Matt Wolsfeld, as was said, and I am the Community Engagement Coordinator at the University of Saskatchewan's Office of Sustainability. Position changing soon. I'll be the reporting and engagement specialist, I think. So we're going to be kind of shifting up sort of where our focus is in sustainability in the coming years to align with our strategy. But so I presented last time to this group about, I believe, sort of a history of waste. I called it the cynical history of waste, and kind of went through that. And this time around, I'd like to keep it sort of similarly real, but in a more practical perspective. And so I do this presentation a lot with students across campus and also with schools in our public and Catholic school boards in the city, with students who are taking on this kind of work. Because when it comes to sustainability, we're often dealing with what we call wicked problems, problems that are composed of a million different tiny moving parts, to the point that you often don't know where to start or don't know how to address them, and they can feel impossible or insurmountable. And when you're dealing with problems like those, it becomes critical to be able to identify which parts you should be directing your efforts towards to actually make a change, and how you should be leveraging whatever talents, abilities, and resources you have to address those smaller parts of the problem. And so I've got a ton of slides here, and I'll see how much I can get through because I'm just kind of passionate with the topic, so I kind of try and shove some stuff in there. But I'll make sure that we don't go longer than the allotted time here. And I'm going to start off with a process that we call design thinking. And some of you guys might be familiar with this, some of you may not. It's a pretty open framework. It originally was kind of formalized out of the University of Stanford School of Design, the D School, they call it. And it is 5 basic steps, as you see here, that go into the process of designing anything: empathize, define, ideate, prototype, and test. Now, before we kind of dig into it, I just want to look at the word design itself, because it's one of those words that we hear all the time, but just to disambiguate it, when we're talking about design in this sense, it's not just the design that we think of when you are like an artist, drawing, illustrating, or a sculptor or something like that. To design in this route, we're taking the engineering sort of perspective on it, which is literally to make something for a specified purpose, and for a specified audience. It's about being deliberate in our actions and making sure that whatever solution we're creating for whatever sustainability problem we're addressing, it's going to be adequately addressing the audience and the stakeholders that it's intended to address. We also want to look, I'll be kind of coming back to this as we go, but there is so two different styles of thinking that we address in this, and it's reflected in how these honeycombs kind of go about. Does my mouse show up while I'm present? Yeah, cool. So in this initial stage, empathize and define, we're doing what we call convergent thinking, which is taking sort of broad ideas and getting them down into a much smaller, simpler, more specific place. Then we go into our ideate phase, which is divergent thinking, where we explode out again, go to a bunch of broad thoughts, and then we're converging again as we come into our prototyping and testing phases. So we want to keep our minds flexible in the direction that they're going, both in terms of narrowing down and opening up in scope as we go through the process. Now, something that I want everybody to go through with this in their mind is that design without empathy, the first step of that process, is not design. It's a critical part of the word and of the process here, and we can see it every day in examples just like this. Somebody obviously went to great pains to design what they thought was a beautiful building here. Lots of different accents on the edges, on the sides, and the inside I'm sure is beautiful as well. And then they put this sort of nice and sort of just practically designed staircase right in front of the door here. And what I can guarantee nobody took into mind while they were designing this building is that if you follow this line right here, down past here, the sidewalk, I can guarantee you there's a bus stop, or there's a parkade, or another very popular building, something where students are coming from this angle. And everybody knows the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and very few people are going to walk all the way across this sidewalk and up the stairs like this. And it seems like a small issue, but by just not taking that into account, you've got this beautiful building and, focused landscaping that has this ugly dirt path stretching through it, because you did not empathize with the people who were going to be approaching and using your building. Another key example of this, so the Stanford School of Design always does design challenges throughout the world where they put it out to the global engineering design communities. And one year they essentially addressed the fact that in a lot of developing nations, specifically they were looking at sub-Saharan African nations, you had a lot of babies who were being born at low birth weight in zones that were affected by food shortages or famine. And those babies, in the absence of incubators, will often fail to thrive and live beyond a short time period. So they put out the challenge to the world design community, saying essentially, can we create incubators that will work in these communities to keep these babies alive? And you have a lot of submissions coming in from global engineering, design, contracting firms that are either maybe too complex. They might not, you might need a specialist or a doctor to run this incubator, and they might have a midwife at best in this village that they're using it in. Or too expensive, something that might be simple to run but cost $20,000 and the village might have $20 between everybody in there. Or even just electricity, something that might need, a good power source to run on, and the village may not have electricity, may have faulty generators, things like that. So all of these things that are addressing an issue that we're familiar with in maybe our developed nations in a certain way, but not looking at it from somebody else's perspective and empathizing with the true users of this. And the eventual winners of the competition were the Stanford School of Design students themselves, who took the opportunity to organize a class trip to a remote village in Nepal, which they kind of decided it was at that time a good sort of sample group for a similar type of community. And they go there and they spend a week or two talking to the people, just getting an understanding for what their lives are like, the way they think, the way they go about their days, walking through the village, observing the people as they go about their days, and understanding really what it's like to live in their shoes. And their end product is what they called the embrace. It's essentially a sleeping bag with an insert in it that you throw into a pot of boiling water. It keeps the sleeping bag warm for up to 8 hours. It's got straps on it. The mother can attach it to her. She can go around the town kind of doing her daily activities, shopping, whatever she needs to do. And the baby is being kept warm, you know, at a good incubating temperature throughout the day. Is it going to address every case that is going to come up in these situations? No. Some babies, you know, might be in certain positions where only a medical, like a hospital grade incubator would suffice. But in 95 to 99% of scenarios, this is going to address the key issue that was being presented to them. And they had to decide that the question being asked of them was not how do we design an incubator for developing nations? The question was how do we keep babies warm? That was it. It was as simple as that. And part of this process is looking at the question that you're asking to begin with and deciding, is this really the question that needs to be asking? So going into the process, there are a couple of rules of engagement, and I often do this as sort of a more workshop style presentation where I will take time in between slides to let students kind of dig in as a group and do some back and forth work, some work on paper to kind of come up with ideas. And as part of that, there are some rules of engagement that I established. Number one, absolutely no judgment. In the design process, there's no such thing as a bad or a stupid idea. In fact, some of the weirdest, stupidest ideas will sometimes come around to create a really novel solution that you otherwise would not have thought of. So you have to stay open, and whenever you're doing this with a group, you have to have somebody who's able to catch negative thinking or sort of judgmental thinking in the process and say, check it at the door. We're going to write it down. We'll come back to it later. We'll see what impact it has. Staying focused is really important because you end up talking about a wide variety of subjects that often people like us who are working in these fields are very interested in. So you can have very interesting conversations while you're going about it. But the fact of the matter is you're putting your brain to work on a very specific process, and you need to be able to shut down those conversations, come back to them later when you're, you know, having a drink afterwards, but being able to stick to actually doing the exercises that are in front of you. Quantity over quality is very important. We often hear it the other way around, but in this process, quality ideas are not what matter. It's the quantity of them. You want to have hundreds, even thousands of ideas on a page or in a workbook to move forward with when you're trying to come up with solutions for your questions. And finally, being creative. I use this example a lot when I'm talking to students, and especially younger students have an advantage of this because when we're younger, our brains are kind of like a floodplain. It's a big flat expanse of area with usually a central river running through, but they'll have a lot of streams, tributaries, creeks branching off of it. And this will represent sort of the way we go through our life with our thought processes. The main river is kind of the general way of life, but we see a lot of different avenues to go around. And when we're children, we'll often say, hey, what happens if I dress like this today and see what happens? Or what happens if I take this way to school instead? Or what happens if I do my hair like this? And you try all these different ways of living, and every now and then a flood will come through the area, cover everything in water, and when it goes away, you might have two rivers, or you might have the river going in a completely different direction because you've been able to change the way that you're living your life. As we grow older, that river becomes a canyon. One straight line, rock walls on either side. We're used to how we live. We get up, we make our breakfast, we go to work, we do the things that we know work. But when we get into a process like this where we have to come in and start thinking, you know, more broadly and creatively, we're going to have to do the equivalent of taking a stick of dynamite to that canyon wall and blowing open a new hole. So sometimes the exercises and things that we have within this framework are very useful for pushing ourselves into a creative space when otherwise we're not always equipped to deal with that in our modern lives. So the first part of empathizing with a group is essentially information gathering and looking at the topic that we're dealing with, not necessarily the question specifically, but just the topic area, and finding out as much as we can about it. There are some of these ways that we're often very familiar with. Anybody in university is going to be familiar with the literature review, going through all your journal articles, all your encyclopedia entries, everything you can possibly find that's going to provide you the peer-reviewed facts about the situation. But in a design framework literature review, you want to be able to break out of that as well, because when you're writing a paper for maybe a science class or a STEM class or something like that, peer-reviewed factual information is what's valued. In this process, not necessarily, because we live in a world where the term alternative facts exists, where people are coming from completely different directions on all sorts of issues, and where people's opinions and feelings will have giant ramifications for real world consequences. And we can't ignore that when we're designing our solutions. So part of the literature review process for this is going to also include things like going to Reddit and trolling around subreddits and seeing what regular Redditors are saying about the situation. Going onto Facebook or Twitter or any other social media platform and seeing what the conversations are happening. Watching all the different sides of the news, whether you're watching MSNBC or Fox or even places like Newsmax, where you're getting this crazy, like, far right perspective on things. But you need to be able to understand where those people are coming as well, because if you're going to be able to work with it or counter it, you need to fully understand the conversation that's happening. We can also branch from that into surveys and focus groups, and those are more direct lines of communication with people to start getting into those opinions and the ideas that are floating around that are maybe less than factual. Surveys are going to be gathering sort of information on climate in terms of what are general ideas that people have, what are general behaviors that people engage in. You can make these as long as you want or as short as you want. I'm a big fan of intercept surveys, where you might just go into a public place like a mall with 2 specific questions and say, hi there, I'm a student, I'm doing a project for this class. I need to ask you 2 questions. It'll take you 30 seconds. Are you able to do it? If you lay out your ask very clearly and specifically, and you're very clear that it's only going to take about 30 seconds, and especially if you're a student, you have a huge advantage here. People usually aren't going to have a problem giving you, a quick yes or no on these questions. You're not going to get a ton of different questions answered, but you could get a ton of responses for 2 or 3 very useful questions. So designing those surveys and the type of survey can go a long way. Focus groups can be extremely useful too, because what they're doing is they're providing you with casual conversation. In a focus group, you're usually getting the ideal number for situations like this is like 4 to 6 people. You're giving them an initial prompt and then moderating your way through. But the goal is kind of to let them talk with each other and let thoughts free flow, because as soon as you put somebody into a situation where they're able to feel safe, comfortable, and casual, they're going to start saying things that they otherwise wouldn't have said in surveys or in a strict interview environment, things like that. And you want people to be able to say what they're truly feeling and it's truly in their head, rather than what they expect people want to hear. And a focus group is a great way of pulling that out. And finally, observation is going to be critical for a lot of these things, because people will say and do different things all the time. If I'm working with, designing recycling systems on campus, and I'm asking people, how often do you think you recycle your day-to-day materials? They might say, I love recycling, I love sustainability, I recycle 100% of the things I possibly can. And if I were to follow them around all day with the secret camera, they might recycle 30% of the things they can over the course of a day. But it's because of self-perception theory, right? They have this idea of who they are as a person and what their values and goals align with, and they're going to change their perception of what they're doing based on those values. So being able to actually watch people and see what the actual actions are is going to come in very handy for a lot of this. I had a great moment at an elementary school recently that I've been referring to as the not everyone goes to Costco principle. And it just really clearly outlines why it's important to go to all sorts of different angles when you're info gathering, because I had a group of students who were talking about an issue they wanted to solve, and they were saying, when, this always happens when my parents and I go to Costco and we do this, and da, 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 da. And one girl in the group said, I've never been to Costco. And the other girl, her mind was blown, because especially, young kids, that it's their experience. But you have to remind yourself that, like, if you don't have a vehicle to carry a lot of things, if you don't have the funds available to buy food in bulk in general, if you don't have money for a membership card, there's all sorts of reasons why this idea of Costco, which is fairly sort of ubiquitous in modern society, is not always open to everybody. And when you go in with your own personal biases about what feels normal to you, unless you're really keeping yourself open to all those other ideas, you're going to miss the fact that some people are simply going to live a very different life. And that needs to be part of your thinking as well. So this is where I'll sometimes break with the students and tell them to make an info sheet. And as you're going through, whether this exercise is going to be like an afternoon or sometimes even a 6-month exercise of designing something, the important thing is that everything that gets discussed and found and researched gets written down. You need a really comprehensive and rigorous inventory of everything that you're establishing in us, because you need to be able to come back and dig through even the smallest things to see what you can find out of that. Now, after you've done your info gathering, we went down to the next step of the framework, which was defining. Sometimes it'll be referred to as capture and define. And what we're really doing there is we're taking all of the information we've gathered on our subject and our topic area, and we're trying to figure out, what does this mean in terms of insights for people in general, for our specific audiences? What does it mean that people are trying to do, trying to achieve, etc.? And a great way to go about this is to look at user personas. This is often done, especially in the tech world, when they're designing products. But essentially what you're trying to do is create a fictional person who represents a stand-in for your audience, for your intended users, and make them as real as possible, be ultra specific, to identify what kind of roles they play, what are their goals, their feelings, their backgrounds, their interests. And once you can make somebody feel real enough, you can start to apply your question to them and figure out, okay, well, what would Christopher think? Or what would Christopher do in this scenario? You're kind of trying to almost D&D your way through it. You're creating an alter ego and role-playing as the person you're trying to do this for. Some really important aspects of this: goals, frustrations, motivations. You want to figure out what people are trying to achieve in their life, what's holding them back, what makes them upset, and what really kind of triggers them to turn away from an idea. What is maybe something that will push them towards an idea or influence them to move further. Those things are going to be really important. I also like these ones that start to look at some of these, like almost these Myers-Briggs type things. I mean, Myers-Briggs, I'll never champion them as being something that should be used in like a hiring process or anything. They're fun. They're just, sometimes people like to say, oh, I'm like this Harry Potter character. It's great to kind of establish a broad idea of sort of people and the things that are important to them. And those can be really important when you're establishing a user persona for these sorts of exercises. Wants and needs also can be very important, especially when you're looking at things like student populations. Majors, colleges, age are also going to be really important, because it's going to have a huge impact on how they live their lives. Everybody knows that an engineering student is living a very different life than a political science student. And so, those things are going to come into it. Empathy maps are another kind of angle on that, which can be very important. Just sticking that user of yours, your user persona that you've created, in the middle, and doing an exercise in terms of what do they say, what do they think, what do they feel, what do they do? Because those are 4 different answers. And if you can kind of fill those out, you're going to start to get a more fully fleshed out idea of who's using this. This sort of process works really good for writers too. If you're a fiction writer and you're having trouble creating characters, this is great to do, because you're going to create a fully fleshed out persona. But it's also exactly what we need to do when we're creating solutions that are going to be people-centered. So this is where I have our students usually create some user personas and empathy maps, trying to get an idea of who they're trying to work for. And at this point, after you've been able to capture and define some of those insights out of your initial information gathering, this is where we try and change our problem statement. This is where we do the change from how do we make an incubator for developing nations to how do we keep babies warm, right? We've learned more about the people who we're designing our solutions for. And this is where we need to decide, okay, what's the actual question being asked? because often the question we start with is usually pretty broad, not specific enough, and it was asked before we really dug into the issue. Now that we know the issue better, we probably have a better understanding of what needs to be solved. We then go into the phase of ideation and brainstorming. And again, I remind everybody of the no judgment, staying focused, quantity over quality, because this is where we let our brains kind of explode into creative territory. And the idea is to come up with hundreds, thousands of different ideas. And it sometimes helps to go in with different exercises, to especially with groups of adults, and especially if you're going into like business scenarios where you've got people who have maybe been doing accounting for 20 years and they haven't had a creative thought in 10 years, and you need to really break them out of their ruts. So things like the mashup exercise, where if you're saying, okay, we need to design a more comfortable hospital stay, well, let's compare it to a hotel. What do a hotel room and a hospital have in common? They both have beds. Where do they differ? Well, the hospital bed is often scratchy, not very comfortable. The hospital bed is usually, or the hotel bed is usually very plush and warm and inviting. But at the same time, the hospital bed has to have the sides that will come up to protect from rolling off. It has to be mobile. It has to be able to move up and down to accommodate, pushing patients up and down. So I start to identify the smaller pieces and components of what it is that you're designing and which are important. And here's where you're just writing down, plush, comfy bed, uncomfortable bed, bed moves up and down, bed has side railings. You're just putting all the components into writing so that you can come back to it later and identify, what your thoughts were on it. Mind mapping, we've been doing this since kindergarten sometimes, where you're taking a central idea and just getting more specific as you break out. And what it's really helping you to do is to break an idea into a lot of its constituent parts. Worst possible idea is a fun one to do with students all the time, because you just essentially ask them, what is the worst possible way we could solve this problem? The problem I always give them is, how do we design a car horn that is not driving people crazy? And one of the worst possible ideas that always comes up is just get rid of the horn. Great, yeah, we've solved the problem. It creates a ton of other problems. It is the worst possible idea. But why is it the worst possible idea? Well, because we need something to be able to signal what's happening in traffic. Or we need to be able to get people's attention while we're on the road if something needs to be signaled that way. And having no horn at all is going to take that away. So we start to recognize the critical parts of the solution that we lose if we start going into bad solution territory. And Crazy Eights is really just something for really visual thinkers, where you take a piece of paper, divide it into 8 segments, and you give yourself 30 seconds for each segment to draw a picture of, I don't know, a proposed solution, something related to the topic. Whatever it is, you're trying to get 30-second pictures out into 8 different squares, because what happens when we're combining visual and analytical thinking is it will light up connections in our brain that didn't exist before. The people who doodle a lot on their notes will find this early on in their lives, where if you are, engaging in some sort of visual process while you're going through an idea, you are going to come up with different ideas than you would have otherwise if you were just trying to go analytically about it. So it's a very useful process. Another example that came out of some students recently was the phrase "make our car the Grinch," because they were trying to come up with a solution for more sustainable transportation, essentially. And at the table next to them, people were talking about the Grinch. It was close to Christmas. And one of the girls at the table said, well, let's just make our car the Grinch. And they laughed about it. And I said, well, wait, what does that mean? And she goes, I don't know. Well, the Grinch eats garbage. Can our car eat garbage? And I said, you're talking about an idea for a car that runs on organic waste. Why couldn't that be a potential solution? Obviously, it doesn't exist, in a functional way right now. So maybe we can think of different ways that might be able to contribute to a more sustainable form of transportation. And so by having these real weird ideas, just even about the Grinch going on, but tying it back to our original topic, you can come up with some pretty interesting and unique ideas out of it. I'll skip past this for the most part, because it's just kind of going through a lot of those. But I would encourage people who are interested in learning more about this to look at this Scamper thing because it's a little more detailed than I often have time for. But substitute, combine, adapt, modify, put to another use, eliminate, reverse. By applying those 7 things to a single thought, you'll come up with a ton of differently branching ideas that can kind of get you going into a good direction. Once you have done all of your ideation and you've come up with as many ideas as you can, that's where you need to start narrowing them down and speccing them out. It's very important to have a process for how you decide which ideas are going to move forward or not, and to place specifications on them is very helpful. 3 main ones that usually apply to almost every project are going to be cost, user experience, maintenance. I always give those to students to work with. And you essentially can give like a 1 to 10 ranking system and just start going through your ideas and rank them against your specifications that are important to you. You know, this is going to be super expensive, so we'll give it a 1. It scores poorly on cost. But people are going to really enjoy using it, so we'll give it a 10 on user experience. Maintenance, it's going to, you know, mostly handle itself, but you have to have somebody come in every 3 months to kind of look at it and tool around with it. So we'll give it a 5 or a 6. And once you start judging your things against these specifications, you can actually start to get an objective viewpoint at how your ideas are matching up against your actual requirements for the problem. This comes to an idea that some people might be familiar with in the engineering or manufacturing world called minimum viable product, which is if I ask somebody to design a donut for me, and they start thinking, okay, I'm going to have pink frosting, I'm going to have sprinkles, it's going to be filled with jelly, and you're thinking of all the things you want in a perfect donut. But if you cannot give me a ring of fried dough, you've failed. You have to identify what the very most basic solution is that actually solves your problem. And if you cannot achieve that, then you haven't done your job here. So your specs have to take into consideration what is your minimum viable product. There's going to be a lot of other things that'll come into here, so you always have to take it into what your context is. Maybe one of your specs has to be environmental performance. Maybe one of your specs has to be aligns with, you know, public or like legal codes, because it's going to be, you know, heavily tied to law enforcement or things like that. So take some time to figure out what your specifications are and rank all your options. After that process, you should have an idea of sort of a possible direction for a solution, maybe an early idea for a solution, and you're going to go into a prototyping phase. Prototyping really just means bring your idea into the real world so you can start to see what actually works and what doesn't work. There's lots of different ways to go about prototyping. Storyboarding, or essentially just writing a comic about the experience of somebody using your solution. Somebody's created a transit app here. So they're going, okay, you go to the sign up page, then you're going to go to this where it shows you a map of where you're going. Then you're going to see a summary of your ride. It's going to push that to your phone. That phone, or it's also going to show you information at the bus stop in terms of where it is. You'll have something on the bus that's going to show you. So by mapping through every step of this process, you're going to put yourself in the shoes of the person who's going through the process, and maybe find out where you would have trouble spots. Like, oh, well, if you get on the bus, we want them to have this, but how expensive is it going to be to put these panels on buses and tie them into a network everywhere? That might have a lot more, you know, technological ramifications than we thought of originally. Modeling is very helpful for any sort of physical product that you're making, and the key is not to make an end product. Somebody here is obviously, you know, tooling around with an idea for a VR headset. You don't need the funds to be able to produce an Oculus here, but you do need, with maybe just a little bit of foam tape and a smartphone, to be able to put something together that's going to tell you, okay, how heavy is it on your head? Does it feel comfortable? Is the screen too bright? Do we need to move the screen further or closer to the eyes? You get all of these different ideas of the user experience that you can at least tool around with before you start sinking a bunch of money into creating an actual product. UI and UX mockups, figuring out how people like to go about using something. What colors do they use? What fonts do they like? What do the buttons have to look like? Or how do they go through the process of an app? Things like that. Wizard of Oz is similar like that, where you're kind of changing it on the fly. You say, here's the screen, what do you press? They say, I press this button. So you bring in another sheet of paper that says, okay, now you have this screen. What do you press now? And then they say, I swipe to the left, and you say, okay, you swipe and you get this screen. So by having those screens prepared, you can get them to kind of understand how they're going through it. One that I don't have on here that I really love is a card sorting process, where you break your solution up into all of its constituent parts, put them onto index cards, and ask somebody, okay, can you rank these in terms of what is most important to least important? And you start to get an idea of what people really value in a solution. You might go into a process saying, okay, I thought that people really just needed a cheap option for this, but they didn't care about cost at all. Their biggest concern was that they could pick the color. So if we can just put this out into the world, we can spend a little bit more money on our budget as long as it has 7 different color variations. It gives you a good idea of what people are willing to actually buy into. And then the biggest thing is, once you get past that to the piloting stage, it's going to be an iterative process. Piloting can last anywhere from a month to 3 months to 3 years, depending on the scale and scope of your project. The biggest thing is that you are taking constant data out of the pilot, you're tweaking it as you go, and at the end of it, you have a mechanism for being able to look at, pull it back to your specs. How did we achieve, or what did we achieve? How do we do against our specs? What needs to be improved? What were barriers? What did people like? What did people not like? And then you go back to empathize and you start the process all over again. This framework may not get you a good solution on the first try. It may not get you a good solution on the 7th try. But on the 19th iteration, you might have a perfect world-changing solution. And the whole idea is learning from mistakes, learning from failures, and getting closer to your users with each passing step. I have another section of it that I sometimes go into after this, but I'm going to close us off now because we are, I think, at 40 minutes or so. So I'm going to open up for some questions if we have some time.
Perfect. That sounds great. Super great presentation. Walking through the steps like that, and especially when you were talking about, doesn't the accountant get to use the creative side of their brain very much? And I kind of had a little chuckle, and I was like, that's so true. Even as I've been working through my degree, I'm like, how often do I actually think outside of the box and not just like sit there with my calculator and do it step by step? So that's such a great point when looking at problem solving.
I'm a musician and an artist who did a STEM degree, so I know all too well about the pain of finishing your degree and realizing that you shut your creative side off for 4 years.
Yeah, you definitely get to see both sides of that dichotomy, so that's pretty cool.